welcome to the stage.
I assume that means I should start my video, right?
Yeah, you did it. Nailed it.
Woo!
Where,
Going so well so far.
where are you in the world today?
I am in Marietta, Ohio right now.
Okay.
But I consider myself sort of homeless in general.
I respect that.
Yeah.
A vagabond, if you will.
Yes.
Okay, so to warm you up, I'm going to ask you 3 not very important questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
They're either or, just the first thing that comes to mind. Cake or pie?
Pie.
Ohio State.
Should I elaborate on that?
I mean, if you want to. I think that's the right answer, so therefore I didn't push you.
It is the right answer. I lived in England for 2 years, and they love cake, and it's very weird. They have cake like every day as a normal everyday food.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm like, no, birthdays only.
Birthdays only for cake.
What do you do for a birthday?
Plus pie, you can kind of convince yourself that you're getting fruit.
Right. It feels sort of healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can put ice cream on it.
Right. Until you make a pie and you're like, wow, that contains a lot of butter and sugar. Okay, next question. Ohio State or Michigan State?
Come on.
I don't know. That's why I asked the question.
Ohio State.
Well, because you went to the University of Ohio.
Yeah, I went to Ohio U.
Okay, right.
But
so I wondered.
So Ohio State.
Yeah, I wondered if there's a rivalry such that like people from Ohio, University of Ohio University, hate Ohio State people, like Kansas and Kansas State. Like you would root against Kansas State if you went to Kansas just out of spite. That's not how it goes there.
No. Okay. So Ohio State, I think, feels bad for Ohio U, and Ohio U admires Ohio State. So like they played each other once. They probably played several times, but they played each other at some point several years ago. And like the OU fans were like not sure who to root for. They were like wearing green and red. It was very confusing. So no, there's no. Ohio U knows it has nothing on Ohio State. So
wow. So there's a little bit of an inferiority complex. You gotta work on this. That's
kind of
PR.
the attitude of the whole state of Ohio. I think we know that we're very average. So.
Okay, well, I appreciate that humility as a fellow Midwesterner. Okay, last burning question is: would you pick a hike or a movie?
A hike for sure.
Okay.
I don't really like movies that much.
Ooh, hot take.
Yeah, I'm told that makes me weird and wrong.
Well, I don't know if it makes you wrong. It might make you. Why do you hate movies?
I don't hate movies. I just don't.
Sorry, I polarized that like a very internet way. I was like, why do you want all screenwriters to be dead?
Yeah, I just feel like there's such a commitment, it's like 2 hours, and what if it's not very good? And it takes you a while to figure out if it's good, and then you're like, oh, did I just waste a half hour by the time you realize it's not very good? Mm-hmm. I like the movie Big Lebowski, and that is it.
Okay.
Big Lebowski here, all others here.
I can respect this take. I have living in LA for so long. I would like to say that I've gotten to know the movie world better, but because TV has sort of taken over everything, it's hard to figure out like who's doing what and all that. One thing that I have tried to learn is to treat movies like books, where with books, I'm going to follow certain authors and read all of the books that they write. And I think as we age, we start to realize like, oh, I liked that movie and that movie and that movie, and they all had the same director. Maybe I should just watch that director's movies. Well done. I
know some stuff.
I know some words. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about you, I want you to tell us a little bit.
Someone's already hating on my dislike of movies.
That's all right.
Sorry.
It's okay. You're used to being on Twitter and immediately changing the conversation towards pissing people off, and I respect that.
Yeah.
Okay, so as a person who has always had a strange career and has had a hard time explaining what I do to people, I wonder, when you're on like an airplane and you have to explain to someone really quickly what you do, what do you say?
Oh, depends on the person if they seem cool or not. Like I probably would say something like, I'm a moral political psychologist, which means I study all of the things you shouldn't discuss at the dinner table or on airplanes.
And then cut it off?
Yeah.
Okay, so what if it's like a person that you think you might want to talk to?
Then I would maybe say that and elaborate on it, perhaps. Okay. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sometimes I would tell, when I was an assistant professor at Durham, I would say I was an assistant professor, and then they're like, "Oh, so you teach?" I'm like, "Yes, but that's, that's kind of like the side hustle of being an assistant professor.
Right. It would
Research
seem,
is more interesting to me."
so tell us a little bit about where you are, not in the physical location, but you were a professor there. What is the day-to-day existence right now as we are talking?
Yeah, right now I am a visiting scholar at Penn, and I'm just working on a bunch of different papers and projects. I'm submitting grant applications. The day-to-day right now is writing and doing revisions on papers. So I go through like cycles where I focus on one thing at a time, because that's how I get the most work done, I find, is sort of focusing on one big thing, finishing it, and then moving on. Even though there are always tons of little things going on in the background. But yeah, day to day, I just sit in this exact spot from like 9 a.m. to 11 p.m.
Whoa.
And yeah, I get up sometimes.
I could see why a hike would be attractive. You're like, more sitting? No, thank you. I will pass on that. Yeah. It would seem, based on what I've read of your stuff and just listening to you talk, that probably you tend to see the world a little bit differently than other people. Did that start as a kid? Have you always been that way?
I don't know. I only see the world the way I see it.
Sure, but you are, you're not a sociopath, I hope. So you are aware that other people see the world differently, right? So you've probably been always aware of like, I'm seeing it slightly differently than other folks. So do you remember noticing that when you were young?
I think, I don't know if it was, maybe I did notice that a little bit, and maybe I always was a little bit odd, and maybe I had a little bit of particular interest, but in my sort of professional life, I had a sort of step back moment, I suppose, only about, what would it be, like 5 or 6 years ago. Because, so one thing that gets a lot of discussion I'm in social psychology, and one thing people talk a lot about is the fact that the social sciences are dominated by liberals, and there's kind of an ideology of the social sciences in general. And I think I was always like kind of on that wagon with everyone else. And then there was a point where I sort of started to realize it and kind of stepped back from it, and then looked at the field more as an outsider rather than an insider. And once you start to do that, you actually kind of become an outsider, because, being critical of your discipline when you're a member of the discipline isn't necessarily going to win you a lot of friends.
Right.
But I think, you need people like me, even if you don't like people like me, to be critical and to be the person who kind of keeps things honest. So, I used to think science was answering a lot of questions, and you could really come to have a particular truth and be right about it and be certain about it. And that is true to an extent, but with like social sciences, where we're studying people, everything is so complex and people can't be studied in a vacuum. It's a moving target all the time. And so I just no longer have a lot of certainty when I used to, and I'm much more skeptical of a lot of things than I used to be. So I think that makes me a little bit weirder now, and that's sort of a more recent change.
Yeah, and I think that that's laudable, especially in the time that we're in. And I don't mean just the last 6 months, but probably the last 20 years, right? Like there's this desire for certainty that is really difficult to back up. I was in Kentucky a week ago or so at Mammoth Cave National Park, and we went on there were no like actual tours. You just sort of be self-guided tours, of course. And we came upon these huts that are at the very end of the cave. And these turned out to be tuberculosis huts. So in like 1830 or thereabouts, a group of people had said, we have tuberculosis and it's not going to work to stay above ground. So what if we went and lived in the cave to see if that would help, right? Like back in those days, I think there was a lot of attempts to cure TB by like going and living in the mountains or going and living in the desert or whatever it was. But nobody really knew how
This
to
was
fix
to
it.
cure, not to isolate. It was to
No, this was like, yeah, in the hopes that it would like
cure.
ease their suffering or cure them. Yeah. And so the guides, you know, when we get down there, they're like, so, you know, what do you think happened to them? Ha ha ha. And we had already seen the cemetery upstairs where like all of them had died. And I think there's that sense of like, those idiots, I can't believe they tried that. But think about like some of the stuff we do in medicine now. I was just talking to a friend whose mother is going through chemo and chemotherapy, like for cancer. In 100 years, we'll look back at that and be like, we were just pouring bleach into people's bodies to hoping that would like cure cancer. Like that's, it's almost as bad as the actual cancer. And I think we have this sense that we know so much, and we look back at other times and be like, those idiots. But at the time, they thought they knew the answer too. They're not dumber than we are necessarily. I mean, they may have less nutrition, and so probably they weren't quite as smart. But
yeah, we are a little bit smug, aren't we? We're like,
yeah.
we look back on the past, we're like, they were bleeding people out and like doing all these weird things. It's like, we're doing so many weird things right now.
Yeah,
we just don't know it yet.
And I think the only way that you can really justify the behavior is to say, we don't know for sure, but we think this might help, right? Or we think this might be true. And I think that you were talking about science and how science works. A lot of what science, in my experience, is you build a hypothesis and then try to tear it down. And it kind of is oppositional to the way we think now, because we tend to think now that like we just spout out these answers and like, that must be right, but we never test it. And that seems strange to me. Is it hard to maintain a dialogue or a professional appearance in the age of social media when you're also tasked with existing on social media?
How do you mean? Like,
so I mean, Twitter is the death of nuance, right? So yes. So what you're talking about is a nuanced approach to like, well, let's take a second and think about this. Mm-hmm. Have you figured out ways to communicate that on social media that are effective?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of what I try to communicate is actually skepticism about other things that I read. Like I'll find an article like, well, here's what the authors said. Here's my alternate interpretation of or a potential alternate interpretation of their findings. Or even when I'm trying to, if I'm tweeting some of my own research, I usually try to tag on like, you know, I could be wrong about this. This is what I think the evidence suggests. But I'm sure I fail at that all the time. I'm sure I make statements that are where I seem excessively confident. And I'll even see other people characterize what I believe sometimes with like, oh, Cory Clark says X. And I'm like, I don't say X. Like, where did you get that from? But obviously somewhere I must have communicated something that makes you think that I am really confident that that's the right thing. So yeah, it is hard. And, you know, people will like, you say something and then someone will retweet it with like the most extreme interpretation of what it was you were trying to say. And you can't stop that from going off on its own and becoming its own thing. But I try at least. And I think if you kind of say out loud publicly to other people that that's something you're trying to do, they'll police you. And that actually keeps you honest. They'll be like, oh, you think that people should have intellectual humility, and here you are saying this, and you're like, okay, fair enough.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, and I think it's also tricky when you're aware of the entirety of your body of work in whatever that means. And that could mean even conversations and podcasts and all this other stuff. And those people don't have that context, and all they see is this one thing where you do sound certain. And they don't know that like, there's been all these other times when you're like, well, I think maybe this will get there. And I think that's one thing that also gets a little bit lost in the world we live in, where people can then cherry pick like that one thing you did. Do you, in getting to know you through researching you, I only know you from Twitter and our communication, right? And you seem perfectly friendly and lovely in that. And then I was like looking at just like your website and your CV, and I was like, this looks like a very serious person. And so I was wondering, like, is it
my website mentions Snoop Dogg.
True. But there's also like, there's a lot of publications, you know, it looks like, is it odd to be perceived as a serious person? Because you do, I mean, like your educational background and there's, you know, you mentioned like, well, I did live in England for a while. And like, there's a certain seriousness to that. Is that something that you delight in, or does it frustrate you that people would think of you that way? How does it land?
I don't know many people who would characterize me as serious, but maybe occasionally it would be okay to characterize me as like productive or hardworking. I go through like stretches of time. Like I goof off like anybody, and I really am a phenomenal procrastinator, and I'll probably go like weeks with hardly getting anything accomplished at all. But then there are other times where I really buckled down. And I think probably when I was at Durham, I had a reputation as a sort of a workaholic because that was kind of like all I had to do. So I would, you know, go in the office, stay in the office pretty much all day, go home, work while I did dinner, work after dinner. So I wouldn't say I'm serious. I've always been a very like goofy person. But I can work hard sometimes, and it's usually when I'm particularly interested in what I'm working on. Like when I'm working on a paper that I don't like, I'm very bored with, it's hard for me to get it done. But if it's a paper that I'm writing that I think like, yes, this is going to be awesome, I know what I want to say, I know how I want to communicate it, then I could work on that all day, and it would be more fun than watching a movie, for example.
Right.
That's not saying eating pie. Well, that's not true. Pie would be more fun than writing, but
So why do you have to write the ones you don't like?
Sunk cost fallacy.
Oh, all right.
Well, I ran these 6 studies. I don't want to just have them go to waste. No, yeah, I have plenty of papers that I've put a lot of time into that I find completely boring. But you know, it's a line on the CV.
Right.
And I started to run the studies, and a lot of the time you kind of get in these commitments with collaborators. You had this idea together and you both thought it'd be interesting, and then it turns out it wasn't interesting, but you've already put in the time. So, but that's not to say I haven't dropped dozens of projects. I definitely have. So when you get to a point where you realize it's not going to be worth investing more time, you have to, and this is something that I learned later than I wish I had, because I actually spent my first 3 years of grad school just chasing around these projects that never turned into anything, because like I'd have a study and it would work, and then I'd have another one and it wouldn't work, and then I was like, okay, well, what I do the first time that it didn't do the second time, and then I try to figure that out, and then blah blah blah. 2 years, 3 years have passed and I've done nothing. Or I've done a lot, but I've accomplished nothing. I have nothing to show for it. So that's something I've gotten better about, because I've paid the price before. I'm like, I'm not going to waste more time on this one.
What, when you talk about setting up studies, how does that work in your world?
It happens a lot of different ways. Like if it happens with a student, students have to do a project, and I say, here are some things I'm interested in. Are any of these things you're interested in? And then they'll say, sure, okay, let's explore that. But a lot of the time it's something I just come up with when I'm having a conversation with someone, like over coffee or at drinks, at a conference, wherever, over email.
Like pie or
where
cake,
you're just,
you know, where you're like, well, let's go do a study on the
yeah,
do Republicans and Democrats differ on their love of pie versus cake? Anyway.
I don't know if they do. That's well, it's not a good question per se, but it could be. I mean, sometimes it happens when I'm like on a run, or, you know, before I go to bed when I can't sleep, I just think of something. I'm like, I bet this is true. And then I think I should test it. And then sometimes I do test it, and most of the time I don't. So like, I'll keep these running lists of like 120 study ideas that I think are interesting. And then I don't do almost any of them.
Right.
But sometimes I'll do one.
And then the mechanics of setting up a study are, it's most, and I'm going to ask this like I'm in 4th grade. It's mostly like surveying people, or how do you go out and actually get the information?
So it depends. Sometimes there are research questions you can ask by pulling together already existing data. So like data sets that the government has. But Yeah, most of what I do is actually running experiments. So there are these different online platforms you can use with people who get paid to participate in surveys. So you just design a study online with experimental work. Usually it's at least two conditions. So one group of people are going to read this, one group are going to read that, and then I'm going to ask them the same questions and see if these two groups of people differ.
Mm-hmm.
So it's honestly pretty easy and straightforward to run a basic experiment. Once you have approval from an ethics committee, you can, depending on how complicated it is, you could design and run a study and collect 800 participants in 24 hours if you wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens a lot now, because to publish in some of the top journals in social psychology, they expect you to have like 8 to 12 studies. But the studies themselves are actually, most of the time, you can do them pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. I am fairly well versed myself in the process of writing things. But one thing that has been intimidating about thinking about talking to you is the idea of researching. To me, that seems so, I don't know, Borg-like. Like it'd be like, I don't understand, it's too big and I can't understand it. Have you come up with tricks or tactics for how to get yourself to sit down and do the research, the reading? I would just imagine there to be some of it that you're really, like you said, excited about, and you're like, I can't wait to learn more about this. But I would imagine there's some drudgery involved. Have you come up with a process that's better than it was, say, 10 years ago for just doing the actual research?
So by doing the research part, you mean like finding sources online and
Sure. I
building a
mean,
sort of
again,
narrative around?
I'm an idiot, so like think of it like I see it as like the Borg, that space ship in Star Trek that's this giant box, and so I don't even know sometimes. I remember what researching was like in high school, right? When you had to do a quote research paper, you would go to LexisNexis and you'd like go find the magazine and all of that. But I guess it just seems like such a vast task to me.
It is, yeah. It really is something that I think just takes practice. So what I use, and what I suspect most people use, is Google Scholar. So it's just scholar.google.com,
Mm.
and it's where you search, and all you get are academic articles. You don't get New York Times articles and things like that. And it takes a long time to figure out what information. So there are like some heuristics you can use. For example, if you're trying to decide which paper to bother reading, you might start with articles that have been cited a lot. So if you search a particular topic and you see one that was written in 1972 and it's been cited twice, and
Mm.
one that was written in 1972 and it's been cited 8,000 times, then read the one that's been cited 8,000 times, because that means people found it more useful. So that's something, and Google will often sort a little bit by that. So it puts like the higher impact papers up higher.
Mm-hmm.
It can be daunting, particularly when you don't know the right terms to use, because sometimes and I see this with my students all the time, they'll say there's nothing written on topic X. And I'm like, okay, well, here are 12 other terms that mean the same thing as topic X. So like they're doing punishment. Well, look up revenge, vengeance, harm. Well, I don't know. This is just an example, but lots of different terms that people could use. Or even with something like politics, you search partisan, political, ideology, Democrats, Republicans. So you need to sort of exhaust your terms too, and that can be difficult. So I think it's just something that you get better at over time, and probably just being able to ask somebody. Like
Mm-hmm.
have my students email me, even students that I don't have anymore will email me, be like, what are other things that I could search for to get this?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it can be overwhelming, but it's something that I expect I'll get even better at. And also, as you just become more familiar, particularly with your area, I already know the names of the scholars who do a lot of work, so I know who to search for. I know like vaguely what terms and papers to search for. And this is probably one reason why, as people get older, they can become more productive, because they
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of it up here already, and they don't even necessarily have to do that much actual research. Like
Right.
Roy Baumeister was one of my postdoc advisors, and he knows like all of the papers that have been written on all of the topics he cares about. So he doesn't even really need to do, I mean, you have to keep up with what's new. But he has so much up here that it's probably really helpful for him. I'll get there one day.
What about the act of actually sitting down to start? Do you have certain things? Like I talk all the time about how if I'm going to start writing, it's turn off my phone, get a cup of coffee, listen to some trashy metal song to get going. Like, do you have any tricks to get yourself kind of into a state of concentration?
I definitely sort out long chunks of time. I'm not the like I heard Paul Bloom say on a podcast. I don't think this was in a dream. I hope not. I'm mischaracterizing Paul Bloom. I think he said he has like a timer that he has ding off every 8 minutes, and he switched tasks.
Oh wow!
Every 8 minutes.
Wow. Yeah.
I never do that. I'm the exact opposite of that. Like I want to have a long chunk of time. So I sort all my other tasks around other things on different days so that I can have a long stretch of time in one day that I'm just going to write, so that even if it takes me a while to get into it, I still have a long time to go. And I always just try to start with the easiest thing, because for me, like the dread of getting started is so much worse than the actual work itself. And if I start on like something that's going to be hard for me, then I'll just sit there like procrastinating and not wanting to do it. So I always start with the easiest thing, the thing that I'm most excited to do. And then you kind of get like a little reward cycle, and you're like, oh, this isn't so bad. And then it makes you feel more equipped to do the harder stuff that you hate.
Right.
And it changes from project. Like sometimes the methods and results are so, like if I'm dreading the introduction, because that's what requires the research, start with writing methods and results, because they're sort of like paint by numbers. But sometimes that's really boring and the introduction is more exciting. So whatever I'm really most excited or most prepared to do, I do first, and then hope that gives me the momentum to power through the more unpleasant parts.
We talked recently with Grant Faulkner, who runs National Novel Writing Month, and we were talking about how like important or smart novelists would say you can't write the first sentence of a novel until you've written the novel. And I would imagine that would be true when you mentioned like the introduction, that like it's counterintuitive, but like you can't really write the introduction until you know what you're trying to say.
You definitely need the results. You don't have to have written up the results, but you need to know them. But I actually, a lot of time, the first sentence is one of my favorite things to write. Not always. I have some horrible first sentences. Yeah. But sometimes it is my favorite thing to write. And sometimes it's like finding the perfect quote, that would fit this paper. So I will start with the first sentence sometimes, but only after I already know like generally what I'm going to say, even if I haven't written any of it down yet.
So next we're going to get some questions from our audience. Scott has carefully selected people who are going to be profound and interesting, which is me putting a lot of pressure on them. First up is going to be Trevor. We're going to get him on here in a second, and he's going to have a question for the both of us. So everybody hang tight while we while the little ones and zeros do their thing.
And it looks like you're drinking bourbon.
I wish. I mean, I don't wish. That would be bad if I were drinking bourbon at 11:30.
At 11:30 a.m.
The end of my
Sunday
coffee.
Fun day.
Yeah. Feels like bourbon
I
at
remember
11:30
California.
is never fun. Trevor, what's happening?
How you doing?
Good. Thanks for coming on. Where are you radioing in from?
Loudonville, New York.
Okay.
Nice.
Great.
Yeah.
I like those blue headphones. Those are very
Oh,
fun.
thank you. Yeah, I had to charge these up real quick.
What's on your mind?
So I just had a question because I'm writing. I'm a senior at Siena College, and I'm getting ready to apply for graduate school, and so I'm writing an honors thesis right now. And I guess I kind of done similar things like that you mentioned, Cory, and like trying to have like big blocks of time while I'll work on it. But in between those times, I feel like I'd be better if I kind of stayed engaged with the topic more between those writing blocks, maybe even just thought about it more. So I was just asking if there's anything that you do to kind of help keep yourself engaged with that topic and just thinking about it even when you're not writing in those blocks.
Yeah, I actually, not necessarily purposefully, but I do find myself a lot of the time I'll get stuck on something in the paper where I can't figure out how I want to frame something or how I want to answer a particular question. And I will find myself thinking about it like when I'm on a run or when I'm in the shower or before bed, and like just problem solving things while I'm not sitting at the computer, and then I can come back. Or if there's like a particular question you need to answer, oh, I wonder if anyone's done this paper. If it's really important, then I'll make a note of it in my calendar so that when I get back to it, I can remember to look it up. So it is a good idea to keep engaged. And I think you also can use those times, depending on what stage you're at, you can use those times to send off to get feedback from somebody else. If you have an advisor or someone who's helping you with a project, and have them make revisions on what you've written or make suggestions, especially if they might change what you do later. If you have to change something early on and it drastically changes what you do down the line, it would be good to get the feedback before you already do the work, right?
Absolutely.
Trevor, how long will the thesis end up being?
Typically it'll be around like 40, 50 pages.
Okay. Because one thing that comes to mind that's a little bit different in writing books, I think it's really valuable to stay attached to whatever you're working on every day, because that makes the job of coming back to it a lot easier. So you may also be in a slightly different vein than Cory's in, because I think she's a lot of times talking about writing papers. I do think that your instinct is correct, because books are so vast that when you take several days away from them, it can be really intimidating to come back to it. And that's what I see a lot with writers here at Writer's Block, is that they will start to procrastinate because the task is so daunting that then they keep putting it off, because they're like, well, I've now waited 6 days and it's going to be even harder. So what's another day? And then the 7th day becomes even harder. So I might also push you to try for 2 weeks, work on it for some seemingly insanely small amount of time, but do it every day. So like say 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever you can manage. Because one thing I found about writing books is that it's a lot like sports, right? Like when you are playing sports, if you take a day off, you'll be clunky the day you come back. And if you take 2 days off, you'll be even clunkier. So you might find that your brain just more quickly gets to it, and that you actually only need those 20 or 30 minutes to really make pretty aggressive progress. And then also treat yourself to longer days or days off when you need them, but consider kind of a diversity of approaches to how you can, like you're both saying, have some connection with it so that sort of relays your brain to the day when you're going to be even more engaged.
Absolutely.
I find like taking a long time off is actually really helpful sometimes. I don't usually do it intentionally, but sometimes for whatever reason, other things come up and I can't work on something for like a week or 2 weeks. And then when I get back to it, I'm like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? Like, this doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And you like coming back to it with a fresh set of eyes is really helpful sometimes. And then sometimes I like don't do that. And then I publish something and then I look at it 2 years later and I'm like, oh, how did I miss that? So now I always try to force myself to like take time off and then go back over it. That can be helpful too.
Trevor, what? So you said you're at Siena, and this is your senior thesis?
It is, yeah.
So what will your degree be in?
Psychology.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm hoping to go into industrial organizational psychology. And so I'm looking into topics of like organizational justice, and my thesis right now looking into procedural justice.
All right. That also
definitely
sounds
do
heavy.
That. Don't do social psychology.
You're gonna you're gonna have one of those CVs that makes me think, wow, this is a serious person.
Yeah, I'm trying. It's a little nerve-wracking at the moment because I'm trying to like do that and then at the same time like make sure all the graduate applications are together and
yeah. Yeah,
Going
I
by
don't
I
fast
remember
for
that
sure.
being very stressful.
Yeah, I don't envy you that task.
You'll get through it.
Trevor, thank you so much for hanging out with us, and I appreciate your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Okay, thank you to Trevor. Now we're going to go to this. Forgive us, everybody. This is slightly clunky, but this is how it goes. And actually, I think it's very fun. So now we're going to get Tana or Tana. We'll find out. This is a tricky part of this, is that I'm just guessing at people's names. Miss person named Hutton is their last name. Welcome to the program. How badly did I screw up your name?
Pretty bad.
Okay, good. You're like, it's actually
Tana.
Melissa.
No,
So
Tana.
it's Tana.
Tana. Okay.
Tana.
So Tana, where are you coming to us from?
I live in Nebraska.
I respect that because I'm from Kansas. You guys are like a slightly more civilized version of Kansas.
I can't really comment on that because I've only driven through Kansas to go to Texas because I'm born and bred Texan.
Okay. So
But
what's
you've seen Wizard of Oz?
Of course, I've been to the museum.
Oh wow.
Oh, wow.
I've not, because
I didn't know there
would
was a museum.
never do that.
Wamego, I believe, Kansas. Little bitty pissant town. There's a bed and breakfast, the museum, like 6 houses, a bar, and like 2 restaurants.
Yeah.
So cute.
So I lied. I have been there.
I've been to Kansas. What's on your mind for Cory and
I
me?
just wanted to ask how you managed to stay focused with everything going on right now. You know, the pandemic, and I'm not even going to get into it. You know what I'm talking about. And but the biggest thing being the pandemic, and of course, elections are, 9 days, whatever, away.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that being over. I've been finding it difficult to stay focused on things. Yeah, because this is just the strangest year ever. But I also make up time in other ways that I think sort of balances out. Like, everything's working from home. I don't ever have to drive anywhere. I never have to shower. I don't have anything to do or anywhere to go. So that like frees up my evenings in a sort of sad way. So finding like other ways to sort of make up for the fact that I've also spent a lot of time like, being anxious about what's happening. I'm similarly like more stressed about the election than COVID, just because I study politics, and so just seeing the conflict play out is I'm like, come on people, it doesn't have to be this way. But yeah, I think I don't have any brilliant advice for you there, because I would say it's been difficult for me too, and I know it's been difficult for a lot of people, and I don't have children, so that is sort of a blessing for me right now, because I know so many people who have kids, and their kids going into school and then coming out of school and then going back to school, and like homeschooling is taking up a lot of their time. But things will get better, hopefully in the not too distant future. At least the politics part should get better sooner, and we'll see what happens with COVID.
Let's dive in a little further though. What would you like to accomplish, Ms. Hutton?
Well, NaNoWriMo.
Okay.
Hello.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
for
writing.
For those who are not familiar, NaNoWriMo is National Novel Writing Month, which is November.
Yeah. And so I joined last year, but I didn't do anything with it. So I might have written 2 words, maybe.
Right.
And so this is going to be like my first official year, and back off, I'm winning, and I will get every single badge.
Cool. What kept you from doing it last year?
I don't remember. I think it was probably the boyfriend, and
okay.
he is the boyfriend. He is supportive, but I was at that point in time, I was putting him ahead of everything else and letting my world revolve around him. And so if he was off, it was, well, I got to go be with him. If, he was coming over, well, I got to go be with him, and plus just, life.
Yeah.
mental health issues.
So I guess the question would be then, so how will you make this year different? How will you make November 1st this year different from
I've already told everybody to piss off and leave me alone.
Okay. So
my neighbor's gonna watch my dog. I've already told boyfriend I'm not gonna see you for the whole month. Love you, but no. And I told my friends, do not message me unless you're dying.
So one, would you be willing to counsel an idea if I throw it your way?
Of course.
Okay. So one thing I see a lot is that sometimes people try for really extreme changes, and that can actually backfire because a lot of times we will backslide in the first few days because it's hard. So one idea might be to, instead of saying to your friends, like, don't message me, message them when you've accomplished the job for the day, whatever that is, whether it's you got to write a certain number of words or whatever. So how can you cultivate those friendships and relationships in a way that helps you push this goal forward and isn't necessarily you going cold turkey? Because probably what will happen is that if you're able to get them kind of feeling like they're on your team, then it will feel like you don't want to let them down, and they'll be there to help pick you up when there are going to be days when it goes poorly. I think, interestingly, this also becomes a metaphor for lots of things. So whether it's accomplishing, your 1,700 words a day or whatever it is, if you're able to then tack something else on top of that. So you're like, well, I wrote my 1,700 words. So now I feel really good. I might as well continue with a little bit of yoga or whatever the other thing is. I think what's interesting is that it will start to all kind of shake out. Like you'll notice that, like, if I commit to this one thing and then I find a way to get positive reinforcement from my social group, then I will move on to the next thing as well.
Okay.
That's
a good point. I mean, I have 2 friends and, four. And, cause you have to include the boyfriend and neighbor. And, and they know, when I'm like writing to leave me alone. And because I can't do the distractions when I'm focused, I have to focus.
None of us can, so don't feel bad about that.
So, and I'm a huge introvert. So they're used to not hearing from me for, months or, weeks and, not hanging out. And, and with COVID, we're not really doing anything anyways. And but I think, drawing them into this, I mean, they have listened to my story, I don't know how many times, and they patiently, listen and, and they give feedback, but they don't know. None of them are writers. They don't know what it's like to go through the process and what has to be there for it to be a novel. And so they're just like, and, they're my friends. Oh, yeah, it's great. Well, why?
Yeah, well,
and
it doesn't,
can I change it?
It doesn't need to be great. It just needs to be making progress. Like,
right.
It's okay if it's bad. In fact, write it like it's bad and that'll work out.
Yeah, I've heard that. And see, I'm such a perfectionist when it comes to my writing. I'm not in like my everyday life, but when it comes to my writing, it has to be what I consider perfect.
Interesting.
And it takes me like, I don't know, it'll take me like 30 minutes to write 1,669 words. And I type 75-ish words a minute. And and don't ask me to do math. And I figured out it'll take 147 minutes to write 10,000 words.
Okay.
And so I can have Nano done in 2 days.
Well, let's ease off on the expectations. You can just take 30 days like everybody else.
So, well, you have to, apparently, according to Grant, you have to write for all 30 days to get that badge. So I was thinking, well, I'd, rewrite my
15
book.
novels.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. I'm going to rewrite my novel and write a novella too. That's what I'm thinking.
All right. Well, let's keep the expectations to all you have to do is write every day. The number of words is sort of irrelevant. And again, I think if you can add an element of joy to it, where you feel like, this becomes something that's fun to talk about with my friends, not because of the content of the writing, but more because of the accomplishment of doing the writing, then there's a much better chance that you get to the end. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
All right. We're I'm gonna ask Cory one last question, but thank you so much for your question, and good luck with it.
Thank you.
Cory, that brought something to mind for me, and that's a question that I think is valid for all people working in the creative fields is like, how do you deal with perfectionism, especially when you're talking about submitting things to esteemed journals and that sort of thing? I would imagine, at least for me, that I would be really nervous sometimes about like, oh geez, I don't know if this is good enough to be in this place. Have you come up with strategies for that?
I shouldn't say I used to. I probably still do this a little bit, but I used to feel like I have to go over this 80 times, 100 times before I submit to this journal, because it seems like such a big deal when I hit the submit button. But the more I've gone through it, I send these off. I have editors read it. I have reviewers read it. They point out mistakes to me. I get revisions back. I have to read it again and again. Sometimes I go through 3, 4, 5 rounds of revisions, and I'm like, it's not going to be perfect the first time, and it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. It's still a draft. So submitting it for the first time, it doesn't have to be perfect. It should be respectful, like, of the editors and reviewers' time. It shouldn't have like tons of typos in it, because that says like I didn't care enough to make sure I don't have any horrible mistakes in it. But I find like when you have a limited amount of time, which everyone does, every time you spend more time on something, it's something else you're not spending time on. So you have to think, what's the most productive way I can use this time? And is it more productive for me to read this for the 50th time, this 100-page document I've produced? Or can I send it off and spend that time starting on a new project or helping that student that I said I would help? And I've had to do that with everything. Like, I used to do this even with emails. Like, somebody would send me an email and I would spend 45 minutes replying, writing the perfect thing, and like checking it. And now I'm like, this is not a good use of my time. Like, if I could do this email in 3 minutes, and then I've got 42 minutes to spend being productive. So I've had to really come to appreciate the value of my time, and that it's time spent here is time taken away from here. And that's helped me sort of be okay with making mistakes sometimes, and being more productive in the long run.
This is going to sound real dorky, but in my math and engineering days in college, you remember like an asymptote, what that is?
Ooh.
So that's when like it's a curve that's like approaching an axis, but it never is actually going to touch it, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I think it sort of looks like an exponential curve, but it really has to do with like it's approaching this particular value and it's never actually reaching it. And so if perfect is 100, right, and that's that value, the truth about our writing is that we're never actually going to get it to 100 or to perfect, and that the closer you get, it's like 96%
less gain.
Yeah, and that like, and if you can squeeze out like. If you can, I always like to think of it as like first draft, if you can get it to 80%, like that's a long way toward where you're going to need to be. And that realistically, if second draft is 95%, third draft is probably only going to be 96%. It's not like you're going to go from 95 to 100. And that when you start to kind of think in that terms, like it becomes, it's depressing, because you're like, I'm never going to write the perfect thing. But it also is sort of like how life is. We're like, well, I'm never going to be everything I want to be, but I can be close and good enough.
Right. And is it worth 5 hours to get 0.2% better?
Yeah, no. Probably not, because you've got pie to eat and movies to not watch.
Exactly.
Cory,
so on the hike.
We're going to now post, I think we need to link, Scott, to Cory's Twitter handles. That's probably the best place for people to like stay abreast of what you're doing in the world. Is that right? Or
yeah, I post on there sometimes, and I think my Twitter probably has a link to my website. And yeah,
and that'll take you to Cory's work and her very intimidating
and my hot takes
CV. Yes, and her hot takes. And I think she would be a very good follow through the next 2 months of madness in the world.
I'm gonna try to just be like calm.
Yes, serenity now. Cory, thank you so much.
Fan the flames.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
All right, bye-bye.